All right. Well, thanks for pressing there and for joining us for our conversation with Alan Smart. Alan Smart is the founder of PhilanthropywoRx's, which is spelled in a special way about which he's going to tell us in a little bit. Uh, in fact, why don't we just start there, Alan? Why is the R capitalized in PhilanthropywoRx's?
The R is capitalized to emphasize the rural focus of the consulting practice.
And where are you headquartered with this?
Yeah, I've been in Winston-Salem, North Carolina now for 17, 18 years. And before that, rural Louisiana.
Okay, you say, but you were raised then in Louisiana and moved up to be with the demon.
Oh no, I was raised partially in rural Maine and then in what at that time was rural Connecticut. Yeah.
Okay, but all rural.
Yeah, for the most part. Have lived in cities, Chicago and Los Angeles, but work-wise and I guess passion perspective has always been from the rural side.
Yeah. Can you smell tobacco in the air in Winston-Salem as we speak?
That's been gone for, you're a little behind, Michael. That's
Yeah,
been gone for about 25 years
a
from downtown.
decade. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's to me a bummer. I mean, I don't smoke, but all right. So
Mhm.
what is the nature of the clientele of PhilanthropywoRx's?
Yeah, there's three or four kind of business pieces I'm trying to tie together at any one time. One would be individual foundations, whether it be family or healthcare, community foundations. Another would be groups of funders, which we either call funder affinity groups or philanthropy support organizations. Examples might be something like uh, Grant Makers for Health or, the Iowa Grant Makers, for example. And then the third kind of leg of the stool is we produce a variety of directories and guides, mostly around philanthropy, but kind of giving a summary perspective of what's going on in the field. So I've done one about what's happening in Northwest philanthropy, in the Northwestern United States, done one just on rural philanthropy and in general, getting into some of the history and some of the pressing concerns going forward. Did something very large project on kind of the history of indexes and rankings and how
Yeah.
philanthropy both supports those and then sometimes ignores the evidence that was in their project they supported. So, yeah.
Taking into account all of the definitional challenges and whatever else might arise in answering this question, how much of philanthropy in America is rural in the way that one would define it?
Yeah, the number you always see is 7%. That's from a old data set, 2010 to 2016. There's actually a renewed effort for an update from the Federal Reserve working with USDA. We're quite hopeful that'll be both more contemporary as well as come a little better science given some new data sources. Does that capture it accurately? I would say no. It doesn't capture a lot of faith-based giving, for example. It doesn't capture well grant making that goes to statewide organizations, but then might have influence or impact or service delivery in rural. My guess, contrary to some of the opinions of people who I talk with, is actually larger than the 7%. But the
Yeah.
7% is always compared to the 19 and 20% of rural population in the US to make a case that rural communities are underfunded by philanthropy, which I'm sure is true, but I'm not sure it's to the degree that how we talk about it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm restating what you said. The denominator in the 7% is a dollar one,
Mhm.
not a it would not match the numerator and the denominator of a population one. Uh, Even then, taking into account the measuring challenges,
Mhm.
you don't want to call it underserved, or is it underserved, or
It's underserved, but we don't know. We don't have any good
the degree?
information on what it's really like. And certainly we don't have good information on which parts of the country or more more underserved versus less underserved.
Yeah.
And there are tremendous geography-based differences in philanthropy and rural, just given the heritage of families and
Yeah.
how assets were developed and things. Yeah.
So you get this question all the time, I know,
Mhm.
but you have a better answer for it, I'm
Mhm.
sure, than most others. If I am a national foundation, or I think of myself as a national foundation, or the
Mhm.
board wants it to be, or wanted it to have been a national foundation, and I happen to be headquartered in a city,
Mhm.
should I put it on the coast just to likely on a coast? Why should I do rural philanthropy?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. One, the ability to create impact in a way that is both quicker and probably more fundamental, given the smaller populations, is really a tremendous place to do good, test out ideas, evaluate concepts, and really create some fundamental change in places that, just given the scale of cities, you can't. A second reason would be there's in many rural places little philanthropic activity. You're not competing with other philanthropies for where you're kind of piling on. I
Yeah,
think my memory says going back probably a decade ago, there must have been 5 or 7 national philanthropies along with local philanthropies in Charlotte, North Carolina, working on early childhood.
yeah,
And so just the kind of noise of, almost competing with other funders for who's getting traction just doesn't happen in rural. So it's a great place to really do some good, sincere, local kind of committed work.
right,
Um,
okay.
and I think the third would be this rural urban divide is artificial in the sense of where people live and work and how they trade goods, and the idea that the things happen in cities are only impacted by people who live in the cities. No, people, particularly in healthcare or education, are traveling 30, 50, 75 miles into cities to work,
Yeah,
and they're going back. Their children, are going to rural schools. Then the city is counting upon the workforce, to be developed to go back to the city. And this idea that they're segregated, maybe obviously in some of our political discussions, but they're not separated in reality in most rural places. There are frontier communities that are so far from a city, they are separate and isolated. But I think that's absolutely the minority of rural places. The majority, if funders, national or other regional large funders, were to actually think about what they were doing, they would understand the connectivity on day-to-day basis between rural and urban.
yeah. You would not like me to look for, find, construct a map with borders between urban and
Not at
rural.
all. And
Uh,
then we always say urban, rural. Obviously, in
yeah,
many larger cities, there's hundreds of miles of suburban areas that were once rural. The people living in the suburban areas often have a cultural, engagement with the self-defining as rural, but now they're living in a place that is suddenly suburban. It's far more complex than what many of the discussions
when I worked at the Bradley
offer.
Foundation, there was a program interest in school choice.
Mhm.
Need to get into the merits of that, but it is
Yep,
the case that
sure.
we would say to our board, Milwaukee is a well-sized playing field to try this out.
Mhm.
And I think we were right, which is not unlike what you were characterizing as a positive of engaging in rural philanthropy. I kind of want to ask you, how big can a city be before it's urban? I mean, the porous borders between urban and rural, or the lack of them, says what to me? How big can a city be before you've got to just admit uh, it's in the other category? Or that's another way of asking the same question.
Yeah, I don't think I have a great singular answer to that, because certainly in some states, the city might be 45,000 people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And in other places, a city might be, a newly kind of suburban area of 200,000 people, and
yeah.
that is a whole different
Yeah,
character. I when I do workshops and work with funders and particularly boards who get hung up on this, what's rural, what's urban.
yeah, yeah,
My my evangelical statement is kind of like rural is if people think they're rural, they're rural. If people think
yeah,
they're urban, they're urban.
yeah.
And
You know it when you see it.
I don't think you should be particularly concerned about what the GIS mapping says. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, the thinking that the well-sized playing field thinking about a
Mhm.
national foundation maybe seeing worth in what we'll call rural philanthropy because you can get more done, really, more
Mhm.
efficiently, quicker, less noise. In certain areas, or to the person, the hypothetical person who works at a national foundation, I put them on a coast. That's an argument that would apply to international philanthropy too, though, wouldn't it? In many cases, in some, why rural over international? If the argument is you can get,
I've never, in all the interviews I've done and all the articles I've read, I've never heard those two posed in that way, but I have heard posed, we know a lot about what works in international rural philanthropy. And
uh,
why aren't we taking some advantage of what is working there? In some cases, 20, 30, 40 years of deep investment.
yeah,
And why aren't we kind of transporting at least some of the ideas around specific issues of how to kind of move the needle?
yeah,
Um, I don't know of people who are actively working on that, but that's an idea that's been floated for a decade or more, probably.
yeah. Is rural philanthropy more, you made reference before to faith-based giving. Is
Mhm.
rural philanthropy more faith-based than your normal major philanthropically funded thing in a bigger place from
I don't believe so. I think some of the data, this new data exploration with the Federal Reserve and USDA will take a little better look at that than we know.
Yeah,
In terms of what's happening, from a data perspective, don't know yet. I'm inclined to say yes, kind of. I think the more important question is probably should it be more faith-based? And
yeah,
I would say yes, no question. And put aside, the denominational or the religiosity, the theory, the biblical theory.
yeah,
I think we can safely say that in places that have a shortage for all sorts of reasons of well-funded, high-performing nonprofit organizations, that often religious communities, whether it be church-based or something a little more ecumenical, are absolutely critical stakeholders to do important good work.
yeah,
And maybe that's, kind of social service side, maybe that's community leadership. Maybe that's advocating for what rural places don't have in terms of resources. So no, they're in the ideal, I would say, if you saw a chart of kind of grant dollars to rural and urban, there should be a disproportionate amount of grant dollars going to faith-based groups of whatever stripe they are.
yeah, yeah. How much ignorance do I show if I ask whether rural philanthropy is more uh, agricultural or is that also dated? I'm probably giving you another.
Yeah, I would say that's not really discussed. I think there's certainly a lot of funders, both local and national, who are interested in food deserts, for example. There's tremendous number of rural counties that don't have a grocery store, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But in terms of, yeah, ag as a business and its influence and diminishing agriculture and those kinds of things, yeah, that's just not part of the discussion, at least today, or hasn't been in the recent past.
yeah. How about IT, internet deserts as well? Is that's a
Probably number one.
yeah,
Yeah. Push aside any issue interest you might have. We certainly saw this profoundly demonstrated during COVID. If kids were moving to virtual schooling and there was no broadband access, or
yeah,
there may be broadband access through a phone, but people don't have data plans that they can afford to support the access. So this idea that now, because there's been a significant amount of federal money that's come out for rural, kind of to build rural, Wi-Fi systems and broadband, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
There's some great examples of philanthropy being involved in building out systems more as a leader, a little bit of a grant maker, leader, kind of leverager of state and federal money. Texas Rural Funders Group has done a fantastic job. And that's an interesting group because it's some really legacy statewide family foundations, but it's some very small local funders and some big healthcare conversion funders and community foundations, everything in between. But they've come around to this idea. Broadband access in Texas is the most important issue they can work on together.
Oh, interesting.
And they
Who?
have had some real success. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
And very short time frame. They started, hope I get this right before COVID, maybe they started meeting.
Yeah.
And then COVID happened and, their work, the necessity accelerated.
Yeah.
And they have drawn down incredible amounts of state and federal money using some of their private money as a, kind of a lure.
What would be an example of a nonprofit recipient group that can and does help with broadband access in rural areas?
Yeah, in some cases it might be the local, old line co-op utility. In some cases it might be some kind of nonprofit cable consortia, that kind of thing. Some cases it might be the county or a kind of a multi-county utility jurisdiction, that kind of thing that, they just didn't have the money nor perhaps the wherewithal to really move on something while having, I think that Texas funder group might have 30 or 40 funders.
Yeah.
Having the social and economic capital that group does, I'm sure endowments of billions of dollars, if
Yeah.
you add it all up, pretty powerful in a small rural place. I mean, there are Texas counties obviously that have 2,500 people in the county or 5,000 people in the county. So
Yeah.
really, really impactful.
It does seem to me and my ignorant, uneducated mind that my guess would be that rural philanthropy is more localist in the way that term.
I would love to say that is true, and for the most part, it is true.
Yeah.
But certainly, there are forces beyond local, which
Oh,
are
interesting. Like, what are you thinking of? Regulatory ones, or
no, there are certainly national funders who are putting funds in rural, with almost without input, I would say, from say local funders or local community leaders.
tell me
Where
more
there
about that. What?
well, the national funder relationship might be with one nonprofit in a rural place. And that one nonprofit may or may not represent the interests of,
Yeah.
the county as a whole. Um, I'm always stressing for national funders or larger funders, we really need to help local nonprofits, local civic groups really connect with local state government and the dollars they have, and try to work together more closely. If it's just one nonprofit with one grant, I think there's a rolling a boulder up a hill aspect to that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Why does that happen? Because how could this be fixed? I guess same question, right?
yeah,
National Foundation A. Should I visit the rural area and they don't, or what? How does one
yeah,
make it?
yeah, I think really understanding what those successful models look like in smaller places where there are fewer nonprofits, where the role of schools or local government is stronger, just because there's not a whole inventory of other groups,
Yeah.
and trying to provide some insurance or asking perhaps better questions or to try to get at if X nonprofit is really working closely with others outside of their sphere of influence.